Welcome back, and if you liked objects from the earlier lessons, you're going to love arrays because arrays allow you to do a whole lot more, and as well a lot of the similar functionality that we saw with objects where we can store multiple values within a single variable. So let's try that again, and we're going to create a person. And when you use arrays in combination with objects, it gives you a powerful way to manage data in JavaScript. And arrays are created with the square brackets. So this is just an empty array that we've assigned. And for the array values, we can now take person and assign values to it. So the way that they work is that they use index values, and index values represent the items that are contained within the array. So you can assign values using the index value, and as well, you can pull those values out and use those values. Let's put some information into here. And we've got person. And note the way that I'm assigning a value is the array name and then the index that I want to assign it to. And the index values, of course, are not as semantic as we saw with objects. So there's no meaning behind index 0, index 1, and it's up to the programmer to decide what they're doing with these. And there's also what happens if I do person and if I do 10, so if I skip some index values. And there's going to be a number of ways to work with arrays that's going to make it more flexible so you don't always have to remember the next available index number that I am going to be showing you in the next lessons. So let's, and I'm using index value of 10 for person to show you what happens. And I'll just put course. I'm not really sure what that is going to represent. As mentioned, it's not the same type of format as we saw with the objects, but we can console log out person, the array of person, and see what's contained. So what happened here is that we ended up with a length of 11. So we've got the first one, which is Lawrence, the second one, which is Specus. We've got 8 empty ones, and then we've got a last one, which has an index of 10, and we've got a value of course for that. So all of these are empty. So if I do person and if I do person 5, it just comes back undefined because I haven't defined any values to it, but it actually does exist. So there's some interesting things here to note about arrays, that arrays have length. So this is a value that tells you how many items are within the array. So even though that they're undefined, they still are going to take up an index value. So it doesn't matter if they're empty or not, they're still going to hold that index value within the array. Indexes are always sequential in order. And just as we saw with the object variables, we can hold multiple values at one time associated with the variable. You're going to have a whole list of items available in there with different index values to return the value. And most of the time when you do create an array, you're going to add in the values into the array so that you don't end up with all of this empty space. Or with JavaScript and programming, that's where you can add objects and values into the array. So let's recreate this and add some values in here. And this is some people's names. And then I'll update that to 3. And also another important thing to note is that arrays are 0 based. So the index starts at 0, so it doesn't start at 1. So your first item in the array is going to return back, is going to be using the index value of 0. So if you want to reference the first item, you use the index value to reference that and using the square brackets. If you want to return back the fourth item, which is in the array, it's actually going to have an index value of 3 because remember we're starting at 0. So once again, try that and see within the array we're returning back the values. There's also the default property for the arrays. So we can do person length, and that will give us return the numeric value of how many items are within that array. And if I do the length before I add other ones, the original length is going to be 2 because we only just had the 2 items at that point, and then we updated the array length and we ended up with 11 in the end. And so even if you miss assigning an index value, they're sequential and it's going to be assigned as undefined. So this is a typical way of creating arrays. You might also see that users are creating arrays using the new keyword and then the array object. And this is a global object. It's a constructor for arrays. So similar to what we saw with the object, that this gives us an option to construct new arrays. And I'm not sure why people might be named test, but this will just give us a listing of people's names. This is to populate the array. And now if we console log people, we're going to see that contents of that array. But more often times now, the way to construct, and most of the time you're going to see this type of format where we just got the square brackets, and then we've got all of the items within the array, and then they're just comma separated. And within the array, you can have numbers, you can have booleans, and different data types. You can also have null, and as well you can have objects in there. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on, so just have that as a placeholder for the object. And you can also have arrays within arrays, so you can nest arrays within here. And then these can have their own set of values. So I'm just typing in some random words here. But so you can get the point that we can have arrays nested in within arrays. So what's going to happen here is that note that the length is still 8, and it's not counting these as separate items within the array because this is a separate array and it has its own length of 2. This object is just empty, so it's just sitting there within the array. And just as before we conclude, just as we saw with objects, we can use const in order to declare the array, and we can still update the content contained within there, because this, once again, it's referencing a location and allowing us to make updates to that content without actually reassigning a value to that object, that variable name that we're using. We're going to look at this in more depth in the upcoming lessons, but it's just important to understand that you can set it as const and also update the values that are contained within inside. So the challenge for you for this lesson is to just create an array and then output the contents of the array onto the HTML of the web page. So just as we were doing before, selecting that element and then updating the contents with some of the content from the array. So use at least 2 items that are contained within the array. You can pause the video here and I'll show you the solution. So I'm going to just put my name, so Lawrence, and that's contained within person 2 and person 3, person with an index 2, person with an index 3. So just as we saw before, document, get element by ID. We have an element with an ID of message, the inner HTML. Now I'm going to use the template literals. And then from here, we select the value of the item, the value of the array name, and then the index value for what we want to return back. So that will allow us to use the content of the array the same way that we're using any other variables. We just need to know what the index value is in order to return back the value. So the item value is associated with the index, and then using the index and the array name, we can return back values that are associated with it. And there's a lot more on arrays coming up, and show you how dynamic arrays can be and how much functionality they can provide in your code. You're probably wondering, well, when do I use arrays? When do I use objects? So there are important differences between the arrays and the objects. So when you are using arrays, these are all numbered indexes. Objects are named indexes. So that allows you to distinguish between the two, and depending on what the scenario is, you would use one, you could prefer one over the other. As well as arrays come with array methods, which we are going to be covering. So that gives you a lot more things that you can do with the content that's contained within the array. You should use objects when you want to use an element name, so something that means something within the name. And as we can see with the person here, these are kind of meaningless, and all they just have is index values. So it's not giving an indication when you're looking at this what the meaning behind the contents of this array is. So you might be able to decipher something from the name of the variable, which you should. You should always have a meaningful variable name when you are creating any type of array or object or any of variable names. And arrays should be used if you want element names to be numbers. So if numbers and order and sequence are good, then that's when you can use the arrays. So also one other thing to note, so let's do people. and do people1, and then equal that to the people array. And then with people1, I'm going to update the item with index value of 2. I'll just put a last name. And then we'll console log people and also console log people1. And we'll see what happens. So what do you think is going to happen here? Do you think that, just like as we saw with the objects, that we can't rename them and that we're going to get stuck with both of them being associated together? Or do you think that they're going to work independently? So let's see what happens. And when we refresh it, we see that they are still tied to the original source. So when we associate one array with another one, then what happens is then they're both going to be operating the same. So this is going to be the same thing if we go and if we update people array and we put another name there. We're going to end up with that last update as the content for both of the arrays. And I'll also put that before we do the updates and refresh. And just as we saw with the objects, they're going to be behaving the same way. That once we reference and we console the content out, we see the content at that state. But as we update it and we see the whole list of the content that's contained within the array, that updates. And the reason is, again, because of the same thing what we saw with the objects, that this is still referencing that same memory location. So we actually have to duplicate the content in a new array in order to be able to update it separately. So when we are assigning the one array to the other, when we're using the assignment operator, what it does is it only copies the reference to the original array, but not the contents of the array, so not the value of the array. To make a duplicate of the array, you need to copy the values that are contained within the array to a new array with those values. So that way the new array does not reference the old array in the address in the memory. So let's try another way of creating an array where we're going to declare the array, we're going to assign a value to it of an array, and we're going to put the contents of one of the arrays that we want to copy into that array, and we'll see what happens. Create a brand new array with the square brackets, and then assign the value of that array, so that will assign the contents of the array to the new array that we just declared. So now if we update people2 and second one to back to Lawrence, and we console log out people and also people2, let's see what happens. So this is the last one here. And so what's happened here is that it's added the array as an item with its own index value into the new array that we just created. So that didn't work. And the other interesting thing about this is that we're still tying the item with the index value of 0 to the original array. So if we make any updates of these, it's going to also be still tied together to the original array. And it's actually added the array as an item with its own index. So we don't want to actually do that. We want to loop through the contents that are contained within the array, and that's why this isn't going to work. And then it's adding a second item with the index of 2 in the array. So let's try one other way to do this. And people3. And we're using the array. So just as we saw with the object, the array is a global object. It's a constructor for arrays. And what it does is it allows us to construct an array, and it's got its own set of methods. If we use from, it creates a new array instance from an array-like or iterable object. So basically an array gets created from an existing array. So this is the easiest way to go using the array object constructor. So now if we update, and I'll output all of these once again, and if we do 3, let's see what happens. So this time we were finally able to have 2 separate arrays and separate them from the memory location. So now these are no longer tied together, and you can update the values that are contained within them separately. So there's no connection between the two, because we've created essentially a brand new array from the contents of the original people array. And one other thing to note before we conclude this lesson, if we do type of, and if we select the array, it's going to come back as an object. Because arrays, even though that we refer to them as arrays, they're actually objects in JavaScript. So coming up next, I'm going to show you some really cool methods that come built in default with every array, and it's going to allow you to do a whole lot more with those arrays. You can see it within your Chrome browser that you've got all of these default methods that are available with working with the content that's contained within the array. We saw that it has an object value, so when we do people length, that's going to return back the length. We can also add, we can also sort the contents of the array, and we're going to be looking at these in the upcoming lessons.